Good afternoon and welcome to the presentation co-sponsored by Women's International League for Peace and Freedom and the Women, Money, and Democracy Committee and the Alliance for Just Money. Please mute your mics and note any questions in the chat. This is what we're going to be hearing about. Today, we're delighted to introduce Gwen Hallsmith, a member of both WILF US and Alliance for Just Money. Gwen is an economist, an environmentalist, a community activist, and musician. She makes complicated ideas accessible and manages to put a positive spin on what is clearly economic oppression on a grand scale. Gwen is the executive director of Global Community Initiatives, a nonprofit organization she founded in 2002. She's the author of 6 books on sustainable community and economic development and has worked with communities all over the world to foster caring communities, local economies, good governance, efficient services, and healthy ecosystems. She founded Vermonters for a New Economy to work on economic solutions at the state level, and the Headwaters Garden and Learning Center, an eco-village in Cabot, Vermont. She and her husband, Michael Taub, sing in a folk duo called the New Economistas. And this summer, one summer, not this summer, but a few summers ago, she organized a flotilla in New York City to welcome Greta Thunberg to the US and used a Facebook called #YouGoGreta to do it. Her books, The Key to Sustainable Cities and Creating Wealth, are available for no cost in the #YouGoGreta group files. Gwen first presented this teach-in in May 2024 at the May Day for Money Action in Chicago, an organizing effort of the Alliance for Just Money. We're so happy to welcome her today to record this presentation. Welcome, Gwen. Take it away.
Thanks, Mary Beth. So great to see everybody here. I'd personally like the presentation to be participatory. So that means you can unmute your mics. There's not that many of us here. And ask questions and make comments as needed as we go. Now, the title of the webinar is Economic Paradigm Change Starts with How We Create Money. And I think that can be true, but it begs the question of what do we mean by economic paradigm change in the first place? Does anybody have a suggestion for what that's talking about? What's the paradigm?
Well, hopefully it's moving us towards a more caring economy than what we've got now.
Okay, Virginia, did you have an answer too?
Yeah, I would say it's a shift from a belief in scarcity, which is currently, if you check AI, that's how economy is defined, as managing scarcity, to a paradigm of abundance and caring and sharing.
Okay. Okay, you've both grasped one of the core. Oh, sorry. Who?
It's a thinking change.
Thinking change. Thank you, David. You both talked about what the paradigms contain, essentially, which are some of the core beliefs of our system or the mindset or how we think about things. And so when you're talking about paradigm change, you are talking about changing how people think about the economy. And so let's see if I can move along. Okay. I don't know why this isn't changing my slide. There we go. Okay. So assuming that we have a current economic paradigm, if we need to change it, who can tell me what some of the pillars are of that paradigm? Like, what are the real core structures or systems that drive our economy?
Borrowing.
Borrowing or debt.
Right.
Yep, that's debt-based money is one.
Right.
Another one, which is central to capitalism, central to our current economy, it doesn't exist without it, is this idea of ownership or private property. And in fact, it's who owns the money that is one of the critical questions to changing the monetary system or starting with the ways we make money. So I always put ownership up above money in terms of where it sits on the priority list. But money itself, yes, is a big part of our current paradigm. We assume, because this is the way it's structured by law and by people currently, that it's a privately owned, debt-based, positive interest, artificially scarce, monoculture monopoly. Now I'll break all of that down. Privately owned means the banks actually own most of the money that we use, about 99.97% in the United States, with the exception of the very small amounts of money that go out in coins, because coins are the one kind of money that we, the people, own, actually. Strange throwback to the 1700s. And that means that the banks and the people that own the banks are the one who make money making money, because all the money that they bring into existence comes into existence through the issuance of debt. So when you go to get a mortgage, when you go get a car loan or a student loan, the banks are actually creating the money that they make available to you to do that. And the way they do that is a really simple accounting trick that only banks are allowed to do, where they're allowed to count their liabilities in the same category as the customer, the things that they owe their customers. So they just shift a liability that you already had with them, because you have to have a bank account there to be able to get a loan from a bank, to another category. They give you the loan, they put that loan in your bank account, and bam, new money is created. New money is created. They don't open up their vaults and give you their reserves. That's not how that works. Although that's how we've been led to believe it works. So the fact that we have a lot of false consciousness about how money works is, part of the problem of paradigm change, because people don't really understand the current paradigm. Now, when they make that money with the issuance of debt, they issue it with positive interest. And that means that, again, the lender is making money on the lending of money to you. So they're making money by making money. It's a great business model if you can get it. It's state sanctioned money. It makes them unbelievably wealthy. And the only thing that has counteracted the natural tendency for that whole system to consolidate wealth and power into fewer and fewer hands was the progressive tax that we had back in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, 50s. I mean, in the 1950s, the upper echelons of our economy, the richest people, had like a 90% tax rate. It wasn't communist, it was actually here in the United States, and that accounts for the large expansion of the middle class during that time. Now, it's artificially scarce because, of course, if money was readily available without this positive interest and all the bank scrutiny, there'd be more of it for people to use for things that they need. The fact that it's scarce is why you're able and willing to pay money to have the money come to you for a house or a car. And the fact that that internally driven hoarding, this hoarding that happens with the monetary system that earns positive interest when it's on an account in a bank, also creates more scarcity, especially in our these days of peak wealth inequality, because these multi-billionaires that are out there, they only need a few pair of jeans, just like the rest of us. So the amount of velocity of money circulating in the economy is a lot lower when there's high levels of inequality, and that's part of the reason the economy is struggling, and why we talk about reaching peak investment and peak debt. But of course, the current billionaire administration is changing that by screwing everything up, destroying a lot of wealth, destroying a lot of infrastructure, because that actually creates the ability to invest and privatize further.
I see David's hand is up.
All right,
Gwen.
David, go ahead.
Yeah. Also, the banks don't create the interest that
That's right.
create the problem in the aggregate. So someone has to fail. The system has to, in the aggregate, someone has to fail to pay the interest that's not in circulation.
Exactly. Thank you for remembering that point. Yes. It's a very competitive game that the system sets up, because they don't create the interest when they create your loan. And so all that debt out there chasing more interest and more interest. And why does our national debt go up all the time? Because they do the same thing on the national level when they issue bonds or borrow money for government infrastructure. So what I call it a monoculture, I'm also referring to the fact that no matter whether you're talking about British pounds or euros or yen or rubles, the monetary system all over the world works pretty much the same way with minor variations, but it's still this positive interest debt-based system. And it's a monopoly. If you tried to pay your taxes with time dollars, they would not accept it. The government says the only legitimate currency you can pay your taxes and debts in is the US dollar or the Canadian dollar or the euro. So that gives the banks a monopoly on creating the kind of wealth that comes with the seigniorage, which is that ability to create money, to coin money, that we've given them, which works actually against the principles of our Constitution. I mean, back in the days when our Constitution was being written, they had a much more up close and personal view of all this. And so they wrote in Article 1, Section 8, that Congress is the only entity legally able to coin money. But in 1913, Congress delegated that authority to the Federal Reserve banking system. And the rest is history, as they say. So the other elements of the economic paradigm are markets with the invisible hand mythology, management by limited liability corporations, top-down hierarchy, privatized profit, socialized loss, and metrics. You know, the GDP and GNP that we use are all valued in the flawed monetary system we use. And they count expenditures. They don't actually count things like human well-being or community stability or full employment or any of the things that all of us really would like to have. So to get at how we change the economic paradigm, I think it helps to look first at some of our understandings of the words that we use. You know, what is wealth? We think of wealth as money, but in fact, if you look at the roots of the word, wheel is one of the roots, and that shares the root with things like wellness and health from back in time, Old English. The little th on the end means the possession of. So wealth in its original form means the possession of well-being. And what does it mean when we say we possess well-being? Well, in my view, it means that our needs are met as human beings. We have a broad scope of needs. And I wrote about that in this book, including the need for health and well-being, empowerment and responsibility, economic security, efficient services and infrastructure, and of course, last but certainly not least, ecological integrity. So once these needs are met, we're actually wealthy, regardless of the status of our bank account. Because economic security doesn't necessarily come with a big bank account. It more comes, as I've discovered living here in Canada, I love it here, that it comes from a society that actually is more dedicated to meeting human needs than it is to enriching the few and empowering the minority. So again, money, just to review, like David said, it's debt. It's privately owned, debt-based, positive interest, monoculture monopoly that encourages hoarding, encourages artificial scarcity, and therefore drives a lot of the things that we don't want in our current economy.
That is money in general, all money, sui generis, or the money that we use today?
The money that we use today. Our current monetary paradigm is all of these things.
Thank you.
If you go with something like a time bank, for example, I mean, you still have your own private time bank account, so you could argue that it's privately owned, but it's not debt-based. It doesn't carry positive interest. It isn't a monoculture, because that is another kind of money that we can use in local transactions, and it's not a monopoly. So you don't necessarily need to eliminate all of these things to have something new. But
what do you mean by positive interest, Gwen?
Positive interest. So when you borrow $100 from the bank, they're going to charge you 2% interest or 3% interest or 10% or 12% or whatever, 18% if you're talking about credit cards. That's positive interest when the number is above zero. If it's below zero, which it has been actually weirdly in a couple moments in our recent economic history, it means that instead of getting paid for putting money on deposit, You will pay to have money put on deposit. And big institutions like municipalities and states often are in this situation because it's a lot of money to manage, and the cost of managing the money outstrip what little pittance of interest these big banks give to our public accounts. So why is there never enough money for everything? You know, I have this old story in my head about a Martian landing on Earth in a community where I used to work in Newburgh. In Newburgh, they have all these beautiful old homes that have fallen into disrepair. Their windows are boarded up. You know, the city owns a lot of them because they've been taken in tax sale, for example. And Newburgh also has a burgeoning homeless population because the jails in the county regularly stop by every day with a bus where they drop the people who are getting out of jail off in front of City Hall and leave them to fend for themselves. So the Martian lands and he sees all these homeless people, and he sees all of these homes that need to be repaired that could be fixed up to house people. And he says, you know, why is this happening? What, you know, and people try to tell him, well, there's not enough money to fix up those houses. And meanwhile, there's all these unemployed people, homeless people that could be working on fixing up the houses potentially. And so the Martian kind of scratches his head. What is this money stuff? You know, it is a ridiculous system when you look at it from the point of view of outer space. Now, the monetary system does more than just cost us money when we want a loan. It also consolidates money, because who gets paid all that interest when all of us are borrowing the money because we don't have it? The people who own the banks. And they and all of their ilk, you know, the people who live on this passive income from monetary instruments comprise like this top 0.1% of the population. Now, this is old data. This is from 2010, so it's 15 years old. I apologize for that. I just love this infographic, and I don't know of another one. So it's gotten worse since then. I can promise you that. All these numbers are different, but the distribution is approximately the same. Oops, sorry about that. So this top 0.1%, their annual income is around $23 million. The top 0.1 to 1%, I mean, we're talking a very small percentage here. Their annual income is on average $2.8 million. The top 1%, we're down to $1 million a year, but we're still not in that category, most of us, I'm assuming. The top 10%, their income, the 1 to 10% is about $161,000 a year. But look at this, the bottom 90% in our country have an average income of $29,840. This group of people barely have the money they need to fix their car so they can go to work if they have a problem or a breakdown. They have very little financial resilience. They're one bad day, one lost paycheck away from homelessness themselves, and it's getting worse because this is a consolidation reinforcing system. You know, people without money have to pay interest to people with money who get richer, and the system just keeps consolidating wealth and power. The monoculture, again, I mean, you hear that word mostly when we're talking about ecosystems, because we know monoculture isn't good for ecosystems. We know planting only one kind of tree in a forest isn't going to keep that ecosystem stable, because all you need is one boll weevil or some kind of emerald ash borer coming in, and the forest is devastated and all of its values are gone. The same happens with our monetary system. You know, once the banks start making bad loans and the whole banking system collapses, like we have seen it happen, the whole economy comes crashing around our ears when it doesn't need to. It doesn't need to. So what's the difference between money and currency then? Because I'll talk a little bit about complementary currencies. Currency isn't, I mean, there's a distinction between currency and money. At one level, they mean the same thing. You know, you can interchange those words. But currency comes more from this idea of a flow or current or energy. And it's an agreement, like marriage or a contract or a business deal, to use something as a medium of exchange. Now, on a grand scale, we have this agreement that most of us didn't make. to use this national bank debt money as the form of the thing that we use as a medium of exchange. But when you set up a time bank or you set up another kind of currency system, you have a different agreement. And because it's an agreement and not a law of nature, it can be changed. So we could decide to change the monetary system that we're using as a whole, in theory. In practice, it's really hard to do. And I know AFJM's working hard at trying to do exactly that. Bernard, my co-author of Creating Wealth, often differentiated between currency and legal tender. He would call money legal tender and he'd call currency currency. But again, in the dictionary, they mean the same thing. Legal tender is that monopoly function of money. That means it's the kind of money that the government designates as the official form that is used to pay taxes and debts. If the government decided they were going to accept pencils tomorrow for taxes, pencils would go up in value quite a lot. So that monopoly function does have a way of valuing money, giving it its value. By that, I mean, in addition to controlling who gets to benefit from the seigniorage that actually was promised to the people in our Constitution. And again, all national money systems are based on the issuance of debt, with very few exceptions. So this is a global monoculture, not just a local one. Now, it hasn't always been like this. This is one of my favorite stories of the past. We're talking about England now, that used to use something they called tally sticks as a public form of money. So these tally sticks would be cut in half, and they had special markings on them, like you can see in these lower ones. And when the government wanted to do something like build a bridge, for example, they would issue tally sticks as a form of payment to the organizations and individuals that they organized to build the bridge. And those organizations and individuals could pay their taxes in those sticks, because it would just close the loop. The stick would go back to the exchequer and they'd match the lines and retire that until they needed it again. This went for 600 years, a very successful thing, fairly prosperous time and peaceful time, I think, roughly. I mean, obviously there's a lot of conflict going on then too, but the system lasted until the rich people got together and decided to set up the Bank of London and get rid of the tally sticks, because they wanted the government to borrow from the banks instead of being able to issue their own public currency to do public projects. So on October 16th, 1834, the Exchequer burned the tally sticks, and the panels on the Lord's Chamber caught on fire and the Parliament burned down. So that's a very symbolic sign that when you get rid of the public dimension of money, you also get rid of democracy and democratic control over the way we create wealth in our societies and meet our basic needs as human beings. Now, community currency is something I've worked a lot on, and this allows communities to create wealth by harnessing a form of local seigniorage and income themselves. This takes many forms, and there are many more forms than I can even go into that are possible, because it's more of a concept than it is an actual thing. Here in this picture, I have a picture of Burlington bread, which was a fiat paper currency that the city of Burlington, Vermont issued for a long time. We redesigned it and reissued it in 2004. And this was the nice reissuance, but today it's gone. It was too hard to manage, and it has failed as a complementary currency at this point. But there still are thousands of local currencies in use. They tend to add stability and value to the local economy. Now, how do they work? You know, that you can design your own complementary currency system by understanding what your community's unmet needs are. So if you have hunger in your local community and there's a food surplus somewhere else, that's an unmet need with an underutilized resource. We hear a lot about how grocery stores are starting to give the food that they have at the end of the day that they don't want to sell as day old to food shelters and other food programs that also could be used to mobilize a currency. Youth engagement, if you're having a trouble with apathetic young people and you want to get them involved in civic activities or other things that would give them experience and an outlook on the world that would shape their future. Excuse me. And you have empty seats in your local sports stadium, those empty seats do not have a high marginal cost. You know, you could provide youth with an incentive to do whatever the civic project is you have in mind by promising them seats at the local stadium to watch the games that they like to see. You have lonely elders and lots of retired people and younger people who need guidance and expertise and wisdom. It's another thing that can mobilize, you can mobilize to produce some kind of current or connection or relationships that would help solve both of those problems. Obviously, you have climate impacts that we're struggling with and lack of buy-in to public transportation. Well, might there be a way to encourage the use of public transportation in your local community through a complementary currency? We've seen it happen actually in Bogota, Brazil, where the mayor decided he would accept garbage from the favelas, which are these relatively informal settlements all around the big cities in Brazil, but that have very narrow streets, and it's hard to get standard trash trucks or other kinds of vehicles down them. So often trash would be accumulating in those areas, making an area of relative hardship worse. But once the mayor said, okay, you can bring your trash out of the favelas and we will trade you either for bus tickets or for food that was grown in the floodplains around the city. It's an amazing success. The favelas garbage cleaned up, people were using public transportation more, and lots of people were accessing food that way. So it doesn't have to be fancy or have money and bills printed or coins printed. It can be as simple as that. Now, there's a lot of this unmet needs and untapped social potential around the world. You know, now it's, I think that the number of people living in abject poverty has gone up since I got this chart. I think it's not going down, unfortunately. Lots of people are living on less than $2.50 a day. There's a need everywhere for education, medical care, social services, and environmental cleanup. A growing shortage of natural resources, you know, and yet if we mobilize some of the underutilized resources that we have in this column to help solve those problems, the world would be a better place. And it's not that hard to do, but you have to get around the guardians of the monetary system who are very serious about keeping it just the way it is. I can tell you from personal experience. There's a lot of different kinds of currencies, as I said, and these are active all over the world. There's what we call social purpose currencies, and these are things for poverty eradication, health and education, elder care, community service, and greenhouse gas reduction. So public goals that are met through the deployment of currencies and commercial purpose currencies. One of these that you're probably familiar with, is the business loyalty systems like frequent flyer miles. Frequent flyer miles are some of the largest complementary currencies out there. There's more units of them in circulation than there are dollars, last I heard. And what's the goal of that currency? Well, to keep you loyal to that airline. Commercial barter systems, I'll talk about more in a minute. And of course, fiat currencies, the Burlington bread note I showed you earlier and other fiat currencies are generally meant to help the small businesses in your community thrive. They're not so much typically for some of the social purposes that I describe here. So the fiat currencies are issued by a central authority. You know, one of the very first ones in recent times that has come into existence is the Ithaca hour, and here we see the Ukiah hour that was based roughly on what it would cost to pay for an hour's worth of work, or what you get paid for an hour's worth of work. That's why the hour comes up, or what a decent wage would be for an hour's worth of work. And an economist in Ithaca, associated with Cornell, was one of the guys who was the original issuer, you know, and their value is based on the guarantee that you can continue to use them. And they do have to be managed for inflationary problems, but most of the time you're really trying to get people to accept them and get them circulating in your system. Runaway inflation hasn't been huge. Sorry, this is changing automatically. I should have noticed that. But here's a bunch of fiat currencies from around North America. And one currency I worked on in Belgium, in Ghent, is something called the toricus. And this was issued by a municipality, the municipality of Ghent, to try and deal with some of the problems that they had in one of their poor neighborhoods, where there were a lot of immigrants moving in and poverty as a result. It was, they needed to do some neighborhood cleanup. There was some goals they had. And so if people worked on these civic projects like neighborhood cleanup or maybe helping establish community gardens, they would be paid in toricas, and they could use the toricas in turn to rent space in the gardens that the municipality provided, which was a very high motivation for a lot of people. This is a picture of Ghent and some of those gardens over behind that fence. They also developed this social cafe where people could pay with toricas. I actually visited this cafe not too many years ago. And they had like a little store, and in the back of the store, there's clothing that people could buy. They have activities, artistic activities, and other kinds of activities in these places. And a lot of the little beautification projects around the community, like these cute little planters around trees and street trees, and keeping these little planters clean, would also earn you toricas. So my idea for the changed paradigm, especially in the monetary system, is to create an ecosystem of currencies. So we don't have a monoculture anymore. We don't have one size fits all for monetary use. Doesn't necessarily mean we have to get rid of the bank debt money, but only that it would be used for places where it's appropriate, where profit can be made from the loan. Not a student loan, not necessarily a loan for housing. All of those things are basic human needs and should not be subject to the storms of profit making that capitalism brings us. So a time bank where you exchange time instead of money is one idea. A care bank is a variation on a time bank that I created in Montpelier, Vermont, with a big grant from the U.S. Agency of Elder Affairs, or anyway, I'm forgetting the acronym, but basically it worked a lot like a time bank where we exchanged time instead of money. But except it being sort of an open marketplace, it worked a little more like an insurance program, because as you joined the care bank, you made a commitment to 4 hours a month of assisting an elder person in the community with something they needed. That could be a ride to the doctor's office or a call in the morning to remind them to take their meds. Lots of things were possible, even just companionship. And so that people in the care bank were able to get in community care without spending a lot of money on it. We also developed a food currency in Montpelier, although we never deployed it. We just worked on it. And that was basically, let's see, we can move on to the different kinds. Here's a time bank where you have basically needs and offers. It's a lot like a Facebook page, only you list what you want and you list what you're willing to give in return. In the time bank I belong to, I offer things like genealogical searching, because I love doing family trees for people, and grant writing assistance, things like that. And yet sometimes I needed a ride to the airport because I gave up owning my own personal car back in 2014, and it was an hour to the airport. It wasn't easy to hitchhike. Now, the neat thing about time banks is all the time is worth the same. An hour is an hour is an hour. And that's what keeps it out of the IRS's binoculars in the United States anyway, because it's considered voluntary time and it's not counted as taxable income. So you can do a lot with a time bank without ever incurring taxable income for it. The optimal balance in your time bank account is 0. If you go negative, it's fine. You just need to go and do something and put that back up to positive. It's not like you're going to accrue interest because you have fewer time banks than you've spent that month. To make time banks is basic community organizing. It doesn't take a lot of technology. It doesn't take a lot of anything that's expensive except the time it takes to run the time bank. And that is where time banks sometimes crash and burn. And it's important to find like an institutional support system for it. And while I was in Montpelier, the institutional support system tended to be the city government. But one in Pennsylvania has been sponsored by a hospital, because the hospital found that by encouraging people to participate in the time bank, they were able to deal with the problem that they have when they release people back into the community and they don't have the social supports that they need to succeed after their surgery or hospital stay or something like that. So they staff the time bank and make it possible. Now, there is a big mutual aid network that my friend Stephanie Rarick runs out in Wisconsin. And she's figured out ways to make time banks work in all sorts of different ways. She usually has seminars online every week to get people involved. And so if you're interested in participating in that, let me know and I can send you her coordinates. Now, these are some of the services that were offered through the Care Bank in Central Vermont. You can see that anything you can spend your time on is fair game for a time bank. If there was things that were needed that were physical, costly dimensions of what it was, like when I would get a ride to the airport, I'd often pay the gas costs of the person that gave me a ride. Another woman wanted to develop to have a baby quilt made for her new granddaughter, and so she paid for the material costs, but the time was traded in the time bank. You can see pets sitting. I would go help people set up their computers. I'm not a computer expert, but I know how to do it. Piano lessons, gardening, rides to the airport, oral history. You see all these things on here. There's a lot that can be done in the local economy using time instead of money. Now, as I said, the food currency was another one we developed. This was a hybrid, a little bit like Stephanie's mutual aid networks, where you could use regular money or national bank debt money. You could use time credits and you could use food credits in this system. The food credits you got by contributing to the food system. So if you were a gardener and you went and helped a local farmer harvest his crops, he could pay you in time credits, in food credits that you then could redeem for food or other things in the food currency system. We were working on developing facilities to put food in storage, because ultimately it was the food in storage that was kind of the backing of the system. A little bit like we think of it as the gold standard, but this was the food standard, right? And lots of business opportunities. We worked with farmers for several years to develop this, and a lot of them saw how if we could deploy it successfully, how it would really help their business, and there would be little businesses that could spring up within that currency system. But again, it was a study more than it was a project at the time. Now, commercial barter systems have been around for a long time. The oldest and best known one in the world is in Switzerland. It's called the Veer Bank, or the Veer system. And this was established back after the big crash in the 1930s, when a bunch of the business people in Switzerland got together. And the Veer comes from like Wirtschaftscirkel or something. It's like a working circle is what it means. And of course, the word wir in German means we, which I kind of like. But they sat around and they were like, my bank just pulled my credit, which is what happens in economic downturns. And the reason I need that money is because I have to pay for my raw materials before I can sell my goods to you. In all commercial enterprises, there's this kind of painful gap between the time you buy the materials and pay the people to create what you're making, if it's something physical, and when you can sell it to the people that are buying it. And that's where a lot of bank credit is used. And it's where a lot of institutions or banks or businesses fail when they don't get those lines of credit anymore. So this particular group of businessmen said, well, let's just see if we can't issue each other credits and debits instead of getting it from the bank. And those credits and debits would be interest-free. And we know that we have the orders coming in. We know we'll be able to pay each other generally. So it started. And banks tried to stop it. But back then, the banks had so little credibility because of the global crash that they were not successful in stopping it. And today, billions of francs, it's Switzerland after all, are traded in the Veer system. It is one of the reasons the Swiss economy is so stable. It's not the chocolates or the watches or the banking. It's actually the fact that they have a second currency system for their business sector that really helps them stay afloat. Studies have been done on it and have shown that the Veer works in a counter-cyclical way. Now, by that, I mean that when the economy goes up and everybody's doing great, the use of the Veer goes down because they want to have their vacations on the French Riviera, and the French Riviera doesn't accept Veer, so they'd much rather get paid in francs when the economy is doing well. But when the economy goes down, the use of the Veer goes up because they can pay their creditors, they can pay their people with these Veer, and they don't need to use their increasingly scarce Swiss francs to do it. That's what we mean by countercyclical. Public banking also works that way in Germany, but that's another topic. Anyway, the carbon currency that Bernard developed for the city of Sacramento is another complementary currency that could be deployed to help us deal with the accelerating problem of climate change that we're coping with. And in this case, individuals who take measures to reduce their carbon footprint, so they insulate their homes or they ride a bike to work instead of taking their car, would get paid in carbon credits. Those credits, that currency, could be used for them to pay businesses that are related to their expenditures. So they could go to the local bike shop and get their bike tuned up. They could buy the things they need to weatherize their home. There'd be this individual and business exchange. And then the businesses could purchase from each other with this carbon currency. Then they could redeem the carbon currency because that's how carbon credits tend to work. And with redeeming it, you either have the credits retired, which at least theoretically pulls the carbon out of the atmosphere, or traded on the global carbon market. Now, the retirement tends to come from big organizations, big environmental organizations like the Sierra Club that are buying up these credits to try and keep carbon under control. But it hasn't been deployed widely enough or deeply enough to be effective. And by deeply enough, I mean, as an individual, you can't start trading carbon anytime soon. In fact, when I worked for the city of Montpelier, Vermont, the capital city of Vermont, and we were trying to get carbon credits for a big renewable energy project we were doing, and I looked into it, the audit requirements and the administrative workload were way too much, even for a city to undertake that trading. So you really have to be a large institution today to be in the carbon market, and the carbon currency could change that. Now, there are complementary currency systems all over the world. Here's some of the countries that have them. It could be more now. The growth in new currencies since the 80s has been extraordinary. Something must be working if there's this many of them. And of course, changing how we think about money, changing how money works, is a significant element of paradigm change for the economy. The money box is actually drives a lot of the decisions. It drives a lot of the commerce. It drives a lot of this artificially induced growth that's destroying the planet and impoverishing humanity. So anyway, I like this cartoon about never think outside the box. How do paradigms change? We now have a small picture of how a new paradigm might work, but what actually changes them? There have been, David.
Yeah, I was going to add a paradigm shift, a thought. If you think of the current Federal Reserve note in your pocket or your deposit in the bank or the check that you get at work, it's actually an IOU. So you've worked, if you worked 20 years, 30 years, or one day, you never got paid in a certain sense because it's an IOU. You just IOU, and we use IOUs as money. So it's kind of it would take a paradigm shift to see that, and then go, and then see how you could develop community and take care of yourself also.
Yes, and real value, true value.
True value. I went from making money to seeing food as more valuable than money.
Totally. Yes.
Yeah,
You can't eat money, as they say. So great. But how do paradigms change? It's not an easy thing to do. I mean, one of the paradigms that at least students of this stuff learn about early is the one back in the 1300s where, you know, the church thought that the earth was the center of the universe. It's called the geocentric universal worldview, right? And there were people that were put to death or imprisoned for life because they said, actually, we think the sun's actually, we're revolving around the sun, not the other way around. Which to most people who didn't know any better seemed logical. After all, the sun comes up in the morning and sets in the night. Well, how do we know we're revolving around the sun? Well, there's this interesting thing called stellar parallax that once they developed telescopes strong enough to look at the stars, they could tell that, you know, when we were on different parts of the solar system, you know, the stars were in slightly different places. And it was that anomaly that led ultimately to changing the paradigm of where we were in the universe, right? So the old system doesn't work anymore, and anomalies, things that are cropping up that just are unusual or problematic, like that stellar parallax in the geocentric worldview, drive additional research or strategies. So the kind of runaway inequality that we have right now, where the top is getting richer and richer and richer, and the bottom is getting poorer and poorer and larger, you know, that's the old system not working anymore, and that's anomalies that are driving additional strategies. Early adopters find new ways of doing things. You know, the people in Ithaca, New York that thought of this Ithaca hour currency were way ahead of their time, but it's spread quite a lot over the last 50 years. Experiments in one location succeed and spread. That's how paradigms can change. Nonviolent direct action campaigns can reduce public support for old institutions. You know, we've seen that certainly with the climate movement and the banks that invest in the fossil fuels that are driving climate change. There's been a lot of actions at banks by people like Extinction Rebellion and other environmental advocates. And finally, the better mousetraps. You know, sometimes it's important just to build a better system, and that will help shift it. Building an ecology of currencies where we have a number of different ways to make exchanges with each other, to build and store wealth for our own security, and to make sure that our children and grandchildren have halfway decent lives, you know, is really important to do for the future. So I have here a bunch of links to things. We have a YouTube channel that has a lot of different educational videos on both currencies and public banking, which is another paradigm change for the monetary system. This Baking for a Better Vermont is a little skit that we did with some legislators back when we were pushing for a public bank in Vermont. End of Capitalism Rag, that's just a song Michael and I wrote about the paradigm change we're trying to accomplish. I could play it for you if you like. It's 2 minutes long. Mutual aid networks, which I mentioned that my friend Stephanie out in Wisconsin runs, that's their thing. There's lots of, all the books I've talked about, the songs I've talked about, you can all find on both hallsmith.org and Global Community Initiatives, or globalcommunity.org. So that's the end of my prepared remarks. I'm happy to entertain questions or comments or even disagreements. I like a good argument. Yeah, Gloria.
Have to unmute here. I want to thank you very much for extremely informative talk. I got in about 8 to 10 minutes late. Did you discuss the Bitcoin issue? Did that ever come up? That's okay, because this is very important what you did talk about. And I had a question in addition, just a utility question. Will this be recorded and will it be available?
Yes, it's being recorded, and yes, it will be available. Mary Beth has the details.
Okay, yeah, because I have some people here in Tucson that are already working on various timeshare and these alternatives, and they will really enjoy this talk. So thank you.
It'll
Yeah,
be
my
on our,
my-
it'll be on our YouTube channel, Gloria, for Wilf, and we'll also be sharing it with the Alliance for Just Money. I'm sure they'll have it on their website as well.
Yeah, my quick take on Bitcoin is it actually is not a paradigm change. It's somehow the worst of what's wrong with the old monetary system. It's artificially scarce, right? They'd set a limit on how many Bitcoins will ever be created. And that drives its value because artificial scarcity is part of our existing system. It uses an enormous amount of energy. And it isn't actually a different form of money because you can always trade Bitcoin back into dollars as long as there's that link to the national monetary system and you have to get it through your bank. It's not a new system. It's just a payment vehicle for the old system. And it's not a particularly good one. I mean, I know people are making money on it. God bless them, but it's not a real change. The real change with cryptocurrencies is the distributed ledger system that they're based on. You know, that is disruptive technology that the banks actually were really afraid of for the longest time. And now they're just getting into it in a big way. So they'll soon monopolize that too if we're not careful. Any other questions or comments?
If someone is watching this program and says, I love the idea of a mutual aid network, or I'd love to introduce an alternate currency or a time bank in my community, what are the first steps they should take, Gwen?
Well, the book, songs, etc. links here. I have step-by-step guides on how to set up community currencies that are in those links. The little booklet that Bernard and I wrote together was our first little book together. It's only about 20 pages long, but it was translated into 13 languages and it's been used all over the world. It's just a simple guide. Like, if you want to do this in your town, here's how you do it.
Give us the title of the book again.
Community currency.
Okay.
It was there back on a slide a while ago, but yeah, community currency is the name.
Are those books still available, Gwen?
All of them are available for free on that hallsmith.org under hallsmith.org/writing. You can download them all. It's that ownership thing, you know, intellectual property when we're in this era of crisis, I just think is crazy. So I've always made all my books and writing available for no charge.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I could ask a question.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit, Gwen, about how you personally understand the relationship between community currencies, I think you're advocating it, and the current money system at the macro level, national currencies in the US dollar, Canadian dollar, wherever. And, you know, you laid out problems with that system. And so what do you understand as the relationship between those? Are those our only two alternatives? Or, you know, can you talk a little bit
the
about
other alternative, of course, is the kind of thing that you're pushing for, which is the public dimension of money, to change money from being privately owned to being publicly owned.
right?
That was the NEED Act. That was the Chicago plan. That was the new legislation that you have introduced.
Mhm.
It is actually a common way of issuing money. In fact, the Canadians were very good at that. That's how they built the St. Lawrence Seaway. That's how they got a public healthcare system, because they did all these things back before the 1970s. And when the world really started cracking down on public money in a lot of different ways, because the bankers wanted to privatize the monetary sphere even further. But those old tally sticks are an example of public money. And public banking can be an example of public money. But the problem right now with public banking is that it in particular is hated by the private banks because it cuts into their business model. With public banking, like they have in North Dakota, you can look it up. The Bank of North Dakota is the only state level public bank left in the United States. There used to be more of them. But during the 2008 crash, their banks didn't suffer the same way that banks around the country did because they have this public bank that serves as their guarantor. And it's like they're having their own Federal Reserve Bank right in their backyard. The Federal Reserve could decide to give everybody in the country accounts and issue public money as a basic income, as a human right in the United States, which is something I think would be a great idea. Public money would require a serious overhaul in Congress that I just unfortunately think is extraordinarily unlikely in the near term. In fact, I think it's dangerous to teach these crazy people that are in Washington right now that they could be doing their own money system because they would use it for all the wrong things. They already are, ICE detention camps and his own private army. I mean, look at what's happening. It's terrible. So that's why I'm less enthusiastic about it these days, because I just think the time has not come. And timing is everything with these things. Once they completely crash the system and we're all in trouble again, I bet you it'll come back on the agenda. And if the right people get into power, it could be a very good thing. It's just right now, it's just, I'm very discouraged by what's going on in the United States, as you know.
It's
Changes the paradigm, changes it entirely. It moves how we invest in our future, how we invest in our infrastructure, how we invest in our environment. We could do environmental cleanup, we could do affordable housing, we could do education for everybody with public money. It puts our value creation squarely back in the democratic decision-making side.
Well, and the fact is people believe that because the Federal Reserve is called the Federal Reserve, that it is part of our government. And it really isn't. It's a confederation of very rich private bankers who own the money system and increase their wealth by keeping the rest of us in debt.
That's right. Yeah, it's about as the Federal Reserve is like Federal Express, it's got the word in it. But it's I remember one time I went to Washington my one meeting at the White House, right, was over this stuff, because back after the 2008 crash, Congress in their eternal wisdom, the day after the Dodd-Frank Act passed, they passed an act that's redlined communities who set up their own energy districts for producing renewable energy and energy efficiency in their communities. Doesn't that sound great? I mean, back then when there was all that unemployment, these energy districts, which were rolled out rapidly across the United States, I have friends out west that have solar systems in place because of them, could have put 900,000 people back to work and created a lot of more economic security through energy self-reliance than we have right now. But the banks didn't like it because the municipalities were giving these people the loans that they wanted to give the people. So they called the municipalities, I love this, irresponsible, and decided to blacklist the municipalities who set up these energy districts. Well, that terrified me because I had just set one up in Montpelier to help fund the district energy plant that we were producing, which was going to be using wood chip energy instead of fossil fuels to heat the downtown. So I went into action and I ended up, long story short, in the White House at the end of the day to complain to Biden, who was the vice president at the time, staff, about what had been done. Because to my mind, the Federal Housing Finance Agency and the Office of the Currency Controller, who put out this redlining edict, were just the right hand of the same organization that gave me this big DOE grant to build the district energy system. And was I ever wrong? I sat down with Biden's staff and he said, well, we've been told by our lawyers not to talk to municipalities about how to deal with this problem. I was like, what? And he said, well, we don't actually we don't actually control those agencies. They're the only way those agencies can change is through an act of Congress. So even the things we think are the oversight of these privately owned monetary fiefdoms at the national level are owned and controlled by the banks. It's just a fact. It was I call it my Wizard of Oz experience. You know, you think you're going to like one of the more powerful people on the planet, and you're told, well, yeah, we can't do much about the banks. That day, it was in December, and I left the office like around 4 p.m. And as I walked outside, all the lights in the buildings around the White House were on. And so it's like you walk outside and all of a sudden you realize the White House is surrounded by banks. They're all there with their bright lights on. Anyway, that's my.
Well, and of course, all those big banks, they want all of the money at their discretion for their ideas of what to invest in, whereas public banks would allow states and cities to keep the money local and invest it locally instead of in far-flung projects around the world that the people of the city or state don't care about and often are against the values of the city and state. Gwen, I want to thank you for being here. I'm going to stop the recording soon. People are welcome to stay and continue to ask questions, but we can't tell you how much we appreciate this. It's been really informative and also very accessible. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Sure. And I just see Lucille asked another question. So I